Korea. If this is your first time joining us for a Link event, welcome. Just want to share very briefly about who we are. Liberty in North Korea is an international NGO. We work with the North Korean people to achieve their freedom. So to that end, we help North Korean refugees escape through a modern day underground railroad. And we've been able to help over 1,300 North Koreans. If this is your first time joining us for safely escape and begin new lives in South Korea and the United States. We then support North Korean refugees in their new lives in freedom and also work to build their capacity as storytellers, advocates, and agents of change on this issue. Lastly, we develop strategies and projects that can help increase the North Korean people's access to information and technology inside of the country. So before we jump into things, I wanted to just share a few quick housekeeping reminders. At the end of this event, we will have some time for a Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop it in the chat anytime. My colleague Stephanie is in there. She'll be chatting with everyone and we'll gather the questions that you have for us. And we will do our best to answer as many as we can. To start things off, please feel free to drop into the chat right now any comments that you have or any thoughts you might have had if you had an opportunity to see the documentary we'll be talking about. And also, if you just want to let us know where you're joining from or what brought you here. I'm currently in Southern California and Jean is joining us from Seoul. Second is, if you any issues at all with sound or with the video, we found that the quality is usually better if you want to tune in from your computer instead of your phone. So if we freeze at any point or you have any problems, I'd suggest just dropping out and then rejoining the event. Lastly, we do have the live captioning enabled. So if you would like to use that, please be sure to turn that on. And if you're having any issues, you can go ahead and send a message in the chat. All right, so to get started, I am very excited to welcome Jean Mackenzie. She is a foreign correspondent and a documentary maker for the BBC. Jean was born in Scandinavia, but she grew up in the UK and today is currently based in Seoul, covering the Korean Peninsula. She previously reported from across Europe and the Middle East, and she is certainly no stranger to bringing forth important stories from underreported countries and catalyzing change through her investigative journalism. And that includes her work on this piece as well that we'll be discussing today. Jean, thank you so much, not only for taking time to join us today, but also for waking up early over there in Seoul.
Thank you, Hannah. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course, I know we have a bunch of people who have joined us today. So big thanks to everybody who's also joining us from wherever you are in the world. To get started with Jean, I would love to hear a little bit about perhaps how you first became interested in North Korea.
Well, as you just touched on there, I mean, slightly, my interest as a journalist, I think, has always been in reporting underreported countries. And even before I became a foreign correspondent, I think I've tried to be guided by two principles, which is trying to tell stories that I think are not being told. So the stories that other people aren't telling, and also giving a voice to people in society who tend to be voiceless and not heard from. So when the opportunity to report on North Korea came up, I felt that it was, I don't know, almost the perfect challenge. The stories of North Koreans are of course, not told enough. And they are probably some of the most voiceless people in the world. So it seemed to me like the perfect fit and the sort of journalism that I love to do and I think is important. And so that's really why I decided to apply for this job and chose to be the sole correspondent here based in South Korea, covering the Korean Peninsula. And I remember, I think as most people do when they become interested in North Korea, the first book I read was Barbara Demick's Nothing to Envy, which if you haven't read it is a fantastic book, where she speaks to North Korean people and really tries to tell their story about their lives in North Korea. And I just thought it was such a phenomenal piece of reporting. And it really set for me the path that I wanted to try and follow, which is to make sure that I gave the people living in North Korea a voice.
That's incredible. I know that you recently made your way out to Seoul. It's only been, I think you mentioned 18 months. So last year, a bit after the pandemic had sort of ended for the rest of the world. But what are some of the challenges that you've faced with covering a country like North Korea? And perhaps how have those challenges increased, especially during COVID or as a result of COVID?
Yeah, I mean, it obviously is one of the most challenging countries in the world to cover, not least because we can't go there. So we can't have first-hand access to the people or anything that we would normally have as journalists. But it's not even, I mean, there are many countries in the world which the BBC can't get into, but we still have access to information, or people within the country can work on our behalf, or they can send us footage, and we're able to report in that way. But North Korea is obviously the most extreme example where we can't get in, and it is virtually impossible to get information out. And obviously, I think we struggle more than most when it comes to reporting North Korea, because we're a broadcaster. So it's not enough just to write the stories. We have to broadcast them. We have to show you, we broadcast on TV and on radio, but we can't get in to gather the pictures or to gather the sounds or to interview people. So that presents enormous sort of logistical challenges. And then I think just the challenges as a journalist comes to how do you tell the sort of full rounded picture of North Korea? It's interesting because I think there is such a fascination with North Korea from, for example, my editors in London and from audiences, still, where everything that happens with North Korea, people automatically see as news because people are so fascinated in the country, but I think sometimes for the wrong reasons. So I'm often here in Seoul trying to explain, well, what we should cover and why we should cover, and it's having that nuance, what is newsworthy when it comes to North Korea and what is not, because people are just so fascinated by this country that they have got no access to information. I think the tendency can just be to tell it all.
Mm-hmm. I think on that point, a lot of people will say, us included, that the media does tend to focus quite a bit on Kim Jong Un and nuclear missiles and on the security issues. And so, as you touched upon as a journalist, then what is your perspective generally on how the media covers North Korea? And then, as you had mentioned, trying to discern some of those nuances. So what do you think should be reported on when it comes to North Korea, when there are so many things you could report on?
It's difficult because I know there is a perception that the media covers perhaps Kim Jong Un and the missile launches too much. And I think coming into this role, thought the same thing, but it's difficult because, of course, with Kim Jong Un, he sets the agenda more so than any other leader around the world, because he so tightly controls the information. So by controlling the state media, he is the person who decides what we get to learn about North Korea, and the rest is completely hidden from sight. So, if he tells us about missile launches or what he's doing, then it's natural that gets the attention. And, with no journalists based in the country, it can be hard to counter that. And there are actually still also very few journalists, I think, that are focused solely on North Korea or on Korea, even based here in Seoul or based in Asia. Many of the UK publications, for example, they don't even have somebody here, or they don't have a Korea specialist. And so if that's not your job, to go beyond those headlines that we get from state media takes an awful lot of time and dedication. When we look at the human rights situation, and something that I know you guys feel is underreported, and I think is fair, I think one thing that journalists struggle with is this perception that human rights in North Korea have always been bad, they are still bad, and they will always continue to be bad. And so therefore, what is new and what is newsworthy about that? And as journalists, we always have to find different ways into a story or something that is new to sort of earn it that title of news. And so that can be quite a challenge when sort of pitching to editors and audiences, because, as I say, the perception is that this is just sort of an ongoing bad situation for the people living in North Korea. But I actually think the more that I cover North Korea, the more I realize how linked the security situation and the human rights situation is. And when we report missile tests, it's not just the missile tests, right? If we look at what's been happening just recently this past week with North Korea and with Russia, and has been happening with North Korea and China over the past couple of years, you see these countries who are now turning a blind eye to sanctions evasions, and, potentially in Russia's case, who are essentially prepared to rip up the paper that these UN Security Council resolutions are written on. And therefore, they are enabling North Korea. And then the missiles keep coming. And there is very little that the international community can do about this. And that feeds into the continued suffering of the North Korean people. So I think if you look at it from this perspective, actually reporting on the missiles and on Kim Jong Un allows us to point out flaws in these international systems that are contributing to some of the failings in North Korea. And so I think that is something I've learned over time, that these situations are increasingly linked. But one thing I always say is it's not about reporting what has happened when it comes to a missile test. I repeatedly say to editors in London and to audiences, a missile test in itself is never news and should not be news. It's what is that missile test telling us? And I think that's the important thing. So it's how we report the missile tests as well, which can have a big impact. And if there isn't, if the missile test doesn't tell us anything new or interesting, then yes, perhaps we shouldn't report on it. And that is often an argument that I make.
I think that's such a very important kind of point that you make around those linkages, and especially beginning to kind of highlight more of those linkages, especially through your reporting and as well as the nuance that you just pointed out. I think that this is, historically something that I know you've done in your reporting, especially as you mentioned at the top around your desire to really try to give voice to people who typically don't have an opportunity to have a voice. And the North Korean people are certainly some of the least heard from, around the world. And so, particularly during the pandemic with the extreme border shutdowns and the restrictions on movement and all of these things, a place like North Korea, which was historically already kind of this black hole, as everyone had called it, somehow became even blacker. It became even darker and harder for us to know what was going on. And so, first, I just want to thank you so much for your incredible reporting on this piece, and really for taking the time to be so thoughtful about putting this piece together, to be able to shed some perspective and insight on what life inside North Korea has been like, and to really give voice to North Korean people that we typically would never be able to hear from. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you came up with the idea to do this piece, especially understanding the enormous challenges that it would take.
So in a way, I think I was fortunate because I arrived here in Seoul, as you say, in April last year, so well into the pandemic, into these border closures. I almost came, I think, with a fresh perspective. So I had this challenge, my job was to report on North Korea, and I arrived and, started sort of finding my way, and was quickly learning that there is no way to report on what's happening inside North Korea, because there is no one inside, nobody's leaving. There are absolutely all our sources of information have completely dried up. So I felt like I really reached this dead end, and I kind of was questioning, well, how am I supposed to do my job? And what I wanted to do was find people at least who'd managed to leave the country during the pandemic, who could shed some light on what it had been like. But they don't exist either. I mean, we know so few people have managed to leave the country since those borders were closed. And so I was interested in Daily NK's work, and I'd been meeting with them regularly since I arrived in Seoul. And obviously, most of their work centers around this network of sources that they have inside the country who report, small things that happen day to day. But I read one of their articles in which their sources had talked to 3 ordinary people, and they had fed back some of what those ordinary people were struggling with when it came to the food situation and their jobs and their livelihoods. And I think that for me triggered the seed. And I thought, well, actually, is that something that we could do, but in a much sort of bigger way, where we really use 3 people to explore the past 3 years of the pandemic and everything that life has thrown at them. And so that's when we approached Daily NK and asked if they would work with us to be able to do this project. And yeah, they accepted.
That's incredible. So as you approached them with this idea and the desire to put together a piece like this, can you share what some of the biggest challenges are that you ran into, and then also, as much as you can share, how did you manage to actually interview the people who were inside?
So I have to caveat by saying we have to be very careful about what we reveal about how the actual process works, just because this is about safeguarding Daily NK's operation and how they work. So I'm afraid I can't give too many details on that front. But I think, at the beginning, I think Daily NK were wanted to work with us, but were a little bit daunted because it felt like a huge undertaking. And I don't think either side, us or them, realized sort of how involved and intense the whole process would be. But the biggest challenges for sure, or the two considerations I had when I went into this, was number one was the security side of things. How are we going to absolutely guarantee that we could keep people safe? And that was at the forefront of my mind. And that was a kind of big question for me for a while, about whether we really should take this project on. We had to be absolutely confident that we were going to be able to keep people safe. But in that sense, I think we were guided by Daily NK. They have been doing this work now for more than a decade, and they felt confident that they would be able to protect these people. And we had a lot of conversations our end with our editorial policy team and our high risk team. And so we came up with a system which we felt, both from us and Daily NK, that was going to work. But the biggest challenge, I think, for me was then, how did we make sure that these interviews gave enough to make them valuable? Because one of the things that we decided early on was that we weren't going to do follow-up questions because it was too risky. So we were going to kind of deliver our questions, drip feed them, but we weren't going to then be able to go back to these people because we had to draw a line as to what was an acceptable level of risk. So we knew that when we, getting the answers from people, that was going to be it. There wasn't going to be any opportunity to clarify or to get more. So one of the things I was very nervous about was, what if we didn't get enough? What if we didn't get full answers? And actually, we worked very closely with you guys at Link to help devise our questions. I worked with your director here in Seoul, Sokil Park, and we spent a long time writing and devising the questions together on the premise that North Korean people aren't used to being interviewed. These people that we were interviewing have never been interviewed before, so they don't necessarily understand what we, the media, need, or how they should answer interview questions. So how are we going to ensure that what we asked them made sure that we got really thoughtful, insightful, and detailed answers? And then once we got our questions together, it was just the process of working with North Korea, with Daily NK and with their sources, to be able to get the questions to our three interviewees. We'd found them ahead of time, so that was, I guess, actually the first step, was finding three people who wanted to be interviewed. And we wanted people, it was important to me that we had people from three different parts of the country, including someone in Pyongyang, which was challenging because it's harder to speak to people in Pyongyang than it is those living near to the border. And we wanted an age range. Now, we never actually gave the ages of the people in our reporting because we felt that it was a detail too many, because we couldn't have these people be identified, but they were from three different generations. That was important as well. And we got their consent, and we tried to explain to them what the BBC was and how far our reach was, and how, I guess, far and wide their interviews would be consumed, and check that they were okay with that. And then we worked with Daily NK to ask the questions. But this took quite a few months. And it was the Daily NK sources on the ground that were obviously the conduits that were working backwards and forwards to deliver the questions and the answers and things. And then once we had all the answers back, we were able to collate them into these kind of actually huge long interviews that gave us just so much information.
It's still mind-boggling to me. And I think especially because there's no way for me to know exactly the process that it undertook, but that you were able to garner such exhaustive interviews and insights from inside. I'm sure, we were talking previously, the full documentary is actually a bit longer than the one we saw on YouTube. But, I'm sure there's also insights far beyond even what you were able to put in the documentary. One of the things that comes to mind, and I think it's also incredibly thoughtful, that you sought out people from different regions, particularly from Pyongyang, different kind of backgrounds and also different generations. I'm curious to know, what were some of the, if any, differences that you saw in responses between the three, depending on perhaps age and region?
I think we were able to get a real sense, actually, about how different life was for people living along the border compared to Pyongyang. I was struck by, actually, that the level of control and repression in Pyongyang seemed to be greater, that people along the border seemed to have a little more freedom. I think that really came across. Also that actually life along the border for many was a lot harder during the pandemic. And one of our interviews touched on this because people living along the border had more freedom in the past and were able to travel over the border or rely on the goods coming back and forth and being smuggled in, to have that lifeline stripped away actually made survival a lot more difficult, even though I think we often think that people living in the border have it relatively good because of the difference in their livelihoods and their lives brought on by these border closures. They were the ones that were suffering the most.
And then did you notice any kind of stark differences in the insights and perspectives that were shared based off of their ages, or perhaps generationally, perhaps reflected in different attitudes toward the situation, towards the government?
I think it would be hard to say generationally, actually, because we sought out people that were doing very different things, right, from very different areas. It's hard to know what the defining factors was in the sort of differences between their situations. The thing that I was most struck by, actually, when we got when we had the full interviews, was actually the amount of similarities between people. It actually wasn't the differences that set people apart. And I think that gave us some real confidence in our reporting as well, because the three interviewees were corroborating each other on so many things. We could see the same themes running across the interviews, or they were mentioning the same laws, the same restrictions, the same hopes and fears and dreams. So that was interesting, actually, and it allowed us to paint, I think, a more uniform perspective than we had realized. And the thing that really stood out for me, I think, was we'd kind of gone into it expecting to learn about people's day-to-day and how that had been impacted by COVID, particularly when it came to food and to work and to how they were struggling. But for me, the overall theme that came out through everybody was this increasing level of repression that people were really feeling in their day-to-day lives. And I hadn't expected that to come out so strongly. So really, that was what I took away from the whole project was, yes, the food situation is bad. And yes, people are struggling to earn a living and there isn't necessarily enough access to food, or the food is too expensive. But it's the way the state is controlling people's lives, ever more so, that is actually impacting them the more than we realized. And the kind of level of fear that people have in their lives now. Yes, we knew that there had been a lot of new laws brought in and the government was, in theory, becoming more repressive, but I hadn't realized that was really trickling down to people's everyday lives and how they chose to live their lives. I remember one of our interviewees, the woman in Pyongyang, one of the things that she said, and this was the one quote that stuck with me more than anything else in our pages and pages and pages of interviews. She said, "I'm more afraid of people now." And that one line just really stuck with me and haunted me. And perhaps it was because we had so much from these interviewees that by the end, I felt like I really knew them. I could kind of hear the fear in her voice and the kind of disappointment that it had come to this, that not only did this repression mean that people were afraid of the government more, but that they were afraid of each other.
I think that's one of the worst parts of COVID that we've really come to recognize is beyond the impact that the pandemic had inside the country. And I don't think we'll ever truly understand that, since it was so closed off during that time, is that coming out of it. And I think that that things were already beginning to move in this direction even before the pandemic had hit. And it really just sort of became the perfect opportunity for Kim Jong Un to actually increase his repression and for North Korea to become even more totalitarian than before, in a certain sense, and to and in many ways to be able to take back even more control. A lot of the controls that we had seen sort of over the last few decades, and a lot of those types of changes that the North Korean people had sort of begun to be pushing themselves. And so I think that that's really one of the biggest tragedies coming out of sort of the last few years, and from what we've been hearing and what your reporting also found and confirmed. I thought that it was also interesting, the amount that people were also sharing just about their extreme dissatisfaction, as well as kind of very openly talking about how their loyalty to the regime was waning. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. I was fascinated by this. I hadn't expected really people to open up about how they felt about the government or to air dissatisfaction. And we actually thought a little bit beforehand about whether we should even ask that question, because it is such a high risk question for people to answer. But we did decide to, because we felt that it was important, and we didn't feel like it changed the overall balance of risk too much. But as you say, I really didn't expect much from that. And yet what we got was 3 people who were willing to talk openly, perhaps not openly, but to us openly, about really how they felt about, being dissatisfied with the government, and also how that had changed over time. One woman said, oh, I used to be, okay, or happy with the government, but since COVID, that's changed. And now everybody's dissatisfied in a way they weren't before. And I thought that was interesting, because also we knew when we were interviewing these 3 people that just by the very nature of them agreeing to be interviewed by the BBC meant that they weren't necessarily typical North Korean people. And we had to be clear about that, because they were people who are willing to essentially risk their lives to reveal the things that are happening in their country that they're dissatisfied by. So either I thought, well, we're going to get people who are just disgruntled, or people aren't going to be willing to talk about that because it's too risky. But actually what we got was really thoughtful answers from people who were saying, well, actually, I used to feel okay, but now not so much, or this is the journey that I've been on, or this is how, people sort of have felt as the pandemic's gone on. And so it gave us so much more detail and insight than we were expecting. And I think it shows to also talks to a really important point, that it's easy to think of North Korean people as completely brainwashed by their state. And what these interviews showed is that people are not brainwashed. They have an awful lot of insight and understanding as to what the government is doing to them and how that's impacting their lives. And they have the kind of normal level of frustration that one might expect. It's just the reason that they toe the line, or, things are the way they are, is because of fear.
Absolutely. When the subjects, when they were talking about this sort of this erosion of their loyalty to the regime, did you see that across the board with all 3 subjects, including the one in Pyongyang?
Yes, we did. I think of the 3 interviews, the man that we spoke to near the border had clearly been dissatisfied for a long time, and you could see that in all his answers. There was more of this kind of pent-up frustration and anger. But with the 2 women we spoke to, we really were able just more to chart a sort of dissatisfaction that had arisen because of the circumstances of the pandemic. For the woman living along the border, because she could no longer get the goods over the border that she needed to be able to run her market stall and run her business and provide for her family. And for the woman in Pyongyang, the frustration was born out of the fact that she was no longer able to afford food to buy food to feed her children. The situation that we found in Pyongyang was, yes, the food was still available in Pyongyang, but it was all the little ways in which people have been able to get by in the past have been stripped away. So more than just, the market traders not being able to get hold of the stuff for their stalls. This woman in Pyongyang, she worked in a fruit and vegetable shop, and she was saying that what she used to do in the evenings was just to sneak a few bits out in her bag, and she'd be able to sell them at the market, and that would allow her to buy rice for her children. And at the same time, her husband would get cigarettes from work as part of bribes for some of his employees not turning up to work. They would give him cigarettes and he would turn a blind eye. But because everything had become more challenging and people didn't have the same money or access to resources, he wasn't getting cigarettes anymore. So without the cigarettes and without the fruit and vegetables that she was being able to sneak out the shop, they then couldn't buy rice. because their state wages wouldn't cover it. So then they couldn't feed their children. And that's where her dissatisfaction had come from, a very sort of basic right. If you can't feed your children, then you're not going to be content with your government.
Right. We are very, we have actually a lot of folks here that have tuned in from actually all over the world. We have people that have joined us from Brazil, South Korea, Kenya, New Zealand, all over the US, and Iowa, Texas, Massachusetts, and more. If anyone that's joined us has any questions for Jean, please be sure to drop them in the chat. We'll be jumping into some Q&A very shortly. One of the questions that has already come in, and I know that you also mentioned this a bit before, but John from Iowa was asking, what was the most shocking answer to one of your questions? So I know you mentioned about the one woman who had talked about how she's most afraid of people. Was there anything else that particularly stood out to you, or something that you were quite surprised to learn about or hear about through the interviews?
I was surprised that 2 of our 3 interviewees knew people in their village who had, or their direct community, that had starved to death. We had obviously heard rumours that people were starving. There had been reports of this. And so I was interested clearly to find out about the food situation. And that was really one of our main motivating factors for taking on this project, and the level of risk that came with it, because we did feel that there was real suffering that was going on behind these closed borders that we weren't able to see. So it was important that we found out about the food situation, but I had never expected that 2 out of our 3 interviewees would know somebody directly who had starved to death. And I think that for us showed how serious the food situation is in North Korea, or has certainly been a point during the pandemic. And although we were careful not to extrapolate about what that meant broader scale, these are just 2 anecdotes, it was surprising.
One of the other things that I know had come up, and I believe this is one of the things that had been corroborated across the different interviews, was perhaps the North Korean, the anti-reactionary thought law that had passed. So, for anybody that's not familiar with this, this was something the North Korean government had passed, and essentially had really ramped up its efforts to more significantly crack down and punish North Korean citizens that were bringing in and viewing and distributing sort of anything that they thought was sort of anti-ideology or anti, especially foreign content, foreign media, things like that. Can you talk a little bit about, the impact of this law and what people were sharing?
So the woman who lived in Pyongyang had told us that she was actually taken in for questioning under the anti-reactionary thought law, which I think probably contributed to this sense that she was more afraid of people, because she didn't know or understand how she had been taken in for questioning, or essentially who had reported her. But this, I think, was interesting because, as I said, it gave us that insight that, yes, we knew about these laws, but they are actually, being policed, and they are impacting people's lives. And the woman in Pyongyang talked about how there were groups who, like anti-reactionary thought groups, police, who would go around now checking up on people, and that this was a very new thing that she had noticed. So the laws, are very much not just being broadcast or sort of there to threaten or to warn people. They are being followed through on, and people are being taken in for questioning, and they are being penalized. And that is scaring people. The man we spoke to who lived along the border said essentially that he was now too scared to watch foreign content, that it had almost disappeared. Because people had just simply become too afraid of the consequences. And he said that the only people that are still watching the foreign content are young people, which he actually said, I remember one of his lines, he said, is giving their parents an awful lot of worry. But so not only is it sort of being felt in people's day-to-day lives, but it's actually working in some senses. The North Korean government wanted to use this law to root out foreign media and foreign influence in the country. And the people are telling us, well, yeah, we're too afraid now. So it's actually having an impact.
Yeah. I think that was certainly another one of these incredibly discouraging things to learn of, especially the impact that that has had, particularly because I think seeing this type of a response from the regime shows actually quite how influential foreign media and information was playing in terms of influencing people inside North Korea, and the regime recognized that sort of threat. And so, the environment during the pandemic was really just this kind of perfect opportunity again, where the borders were shut down, and Kim Jong Un was able to take back this sort of, in some ways, this absolute control over people, particularly around these areas where there had been this sort of undermining of the regime and ideology and all of these things. Just to take a quick step back, I mean, I think it cannot be, kind of overstated here, the grave nature of sort of the food situation in North Korea, and especially how difficult things had gotten. I mean, this is the most difficult that it has ever been since really the famine that we saw in the mid to late 90s. How were North Koreans, or what were they saying they were doing to cope with these incredible challenges that they were facing?
Certainly the woman in Pyongyang, who I got a sense was struggling to buy enough food at all, she talked about how she had gone down to eating one meal a day, essentially just to have enough to feed her children. But one of the most interesting things I think that she said, there's so much, of course, that we never made it into the documentary, and we also had to be very careful about, exactly what quotes we used to make sure that none of it could sort of be jigsawed together to identify these people. But one of the really interesting things she said was, she said, I can endure being hungry, but I can't endure having people know that I'm poor and that I'm having to eat one meal a day. And so she talked a lot about how she was having to pay a lot to her Inminban, to her community, and the kind of the fees and the money that is extracted from North Korean people by the state. All those fees were just continuing to rise during the pandemic, she said. She was having to pay over more and more. And at the same time, she wasn't getting this extra income to buy the rice. So what it meant, she said, I would rather have one meal a day and just, try to survive than not be able to pay these fees and have people around me know that we're struggling. So there was this pride as well that came through. But there was one day, she said, where she didn't eat for 2 or 3 days, and she felt like she was going to die. But still, it's being guided by this, well, that's better than having people know I'm poor. And I thought that was a very interesting insight.
I know that we were talking briefly before we got started here, but since this piece was published in June, have you had an opportunity to be in touch again with any of the subjects, particularly since the documentary's been released, to see if there's been any sort of repercussions or anything like that?
So we have kept in contact with our interviewees, yeah, and we that was part of our risk analysis, that we were going to make sure that we checked in on these people every month or so after the documentary aired. Again, like not too regularly to put them at risk, but regularly enough to know that they were safe. And yeah, all 3 of them are safe. There have been no repercussions, and it was a huge worry for us that would the authorities try to find these people, which is why we obviously kept the details about them so vague, so that it would be impossible to be able to work out who they were. But since the documentary's broadcast, we know that one of the people who we interviewed has been able to be shown like a screenshot photo of a snippet of one of our articles, to be able to show that this went out there and into the world, and people engage with it.
That's pretty incredible, really incredible. We did get a question here in the chat. This individual was asking if you, in any of the interviews that you had done, if anybody had perhaps talked about faith, imagine religion, or anything of that sort of nature had come up in any of the interviews.
That isn't something that came up, no. But to be fair, I didn't ask about faith. But we didn't have anyone mention faith or religion at all, actually.
Yeah, I imagine, especially if there wasn't a pointed question on that, that it may not have been something that they would have openly shared or offered up, particularly because of how dangerous it could have been. Another question is, after discovering all of these realities and sharing these stories to the media, what is your hope for the international audience? How do you hope that countries and people will respond to sort of this reporting?
My hope when I took this on was, I think, to try and draw awareness around the world to the suffering of North Korean people. Because as I said right at the beginning of this chat, one of the things that we struggle with as journalists is to break through when it comes to stories about North Korean suffering, because it is just seen as, well, we know that North Korean people suffer. And so I think it's really hard for people to engage with that. And actually, that was one of the big questions I had from my editors right at the beginning was, well, we all know that, you know, people in North Korea are suffering. So what are we telling people? And I think that's why I was so intent on getting the detail about people's lives. And I think, you know, perhaps some people would have looked at our reporting with preconceptions about what life was like in North Korea, and maybe they thought things weren't as bad as they expected. But for me, it was really, that's why it was so important to chart the entire pandemic period with as much detail as possible, to try and really show that perhaps contrary to popular belief, things actually at the beginning of the pandemic or pre-pandemic were okay for some North Korean people. They were earning a living, they were able to get by, they were relatively well off, and how these border closures had really stripped away so much liberty from them. And all these things that people had been able to do to kind of hustle and to get by were being slowly taken away, to the point where, as you say, we're now looking at a country that is perhaps more oppressive than it has ever been before. So that's what I wanted people to take away, was to really understand that there is nuance in this and that people's suffering has increased during this time.
Do you have any plans to be able to share any of the additional insights that you've garnered from these interviews with, you know, other stakeholders that potentially work on this issue to increase their understanding of what's going on inside?
We have thought about this, and clearly people have approached us and asked to see the full interviews, you know, people who, particularly at the, you know, the panel of experts and the Security Council and UN human rights teams more generally. But we worked so, if I can sort of explain, so each interview was sort of ran, once we collated everything, so like 20 pages long. And we had to work through that to kind of find the quotes that we kind of build a narrative for each person. But each iteration of that went through so many checks, editorially and legally, with all our kind of teams in London, because we and with Daily NK and with North Korea specialists, to make sure that what we actually finally put to air could in no way identify the people, because there was so much detail in these interviews that if you put even a kind of few more quotes in there, you would be able to start perhaps to work out who they were. So each kind of final version was so carefully vetted, and we were going back and forward right up to the wire in the like, oh, actually, let's take that word out, or let's take this detail out, let's take that line out, because just maybe you might be able to infer something from it. And so that's why we do not feel that we can share the full interviews, because we just don't feel that it's safe for them to be in the public domain.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And of course, the huge responsibility to the people that you interviewed, of course. We have a question here from Daniel Lee from Sao Paulo, Brazil. He said, referring to the story about the woman who was scared of people knowing she was poor, do you think that this is also a way of controlling the North Korean people, a sort of social shaming, that she'd rather starve than have other people know that she was poor?
Yeah, I'm sure that is part of the system of control that the state is banking on. That, yeah, exactly as you say, that if people have this shame and they would rather suffer in silence, then that serves the state well, because it means that people will suffer and die in silence.
Mm-hmm. Another question we have here is actually about the fact that this documentary on YouTube currently has over 4 million views, and I'm sure many more from views from within the UK. Has there been either an official or unofficial response from the North Korean government on this reporting?
So we approached the North Korean government before we broadcast through the embassy in London. And they did respond, which was incredible. We weren't expecting them to respond, but they did give us a statement, which we were able to include in the documentary and to broadcast. Since then, no, we haven't heard anything from them. We were worried. I mean, one of the things that we talked a lot about was our own security and people working on the project, and would it make them vulnerable to hacking perhaps by the North Korean government, or would they want to try and hack us to get hold of the full interviews? But to our knowledge, we haven't been targeted.
It is really quite a feat when you think about just the overwhelming process of what it took to create this documentary from start to finish. Just the questions, to how you would communicate, to how you would put this together, garner the insights, decide what would go into this short documentary, even from a security perspective, having to really safeguard those interviews ultimately. And so, you know, this question comes from someone, Ada from Singapore. She says, how do you feel after completing this project? I imagine it must have been overwhelming after putting everything together. And I wonder if you've asked yourself, so what's next?
Certainly with these interviews, honestly, that I don't think I've ever guarded something more safely in my life than those full interviews. That used to keep me awake at night, you know, like, oh. And particularly, there was a window of time in which we were really, really mindful and stressed, to be honest. And it was, we had to give the North Korean government this window to reply. And so we decided to give them 5 days. That kind of editorially that was justified. So there was a period of time before the documentary aired, but when we had essentially told the North Korean government what we had done. And so that we felt made us very vulnerable, because after the documentary aired, we were able to delete everything, you know, all the rushes and the interviews, and everybody around the BBC who had various parts of the content that were helping to put it all together. But that 5-day period between telling the government and then broadcast was that sort of, I think, the diciest time for us. And I've even forgotten the main question now.
The question was much more around, you know, after, you know.
Oh, how do we feel? Yeah.
Are you ready for another one?
Yeah, no. How do we feel? So I think what I was trying to say is that the period around this documentary going to air, I think we were all pretty stressed and worried. And the sort of the kind of ramifications of what we'd done over the last year was sort of, yeah, really in sharp focus, or the potential ramifications. But now we've had enough time between the documentary going out and being where we are now. I think we're all really happy. We really felt we kind of achieved what we set out to do. And as I said, there were so many worries along the line for me about, you know, was I going to get enough from the interviewees to justify the risk? And was this going to make big enough impact for, you know, the risk to be justified? I was constantly trying to balance that in my head. And then the worst scenario would be where we felt we put people at risk and it hadn't been worth it. And that's, yeah, something that played on my mind a lot. But now we think we're really happy, and it has been worth it. And we feel the impact has been great.
I would agree with that. It's been significant. One of our viewers has said that it's incredibly upsetting to hear about the loss of freedoms of North Korean people through these laws. Did any of the 3 interviewees express any hopes or wishes that might come out of this documentary or these interviews? Or I would take that a step further and just say, was there any sort of hope that was expressed that you know, through these interviews, from these interviews?
I mean, I want to say yes. And I think that's something that we were quite struck by, was the lack of hope. I mean, certainly all 3 people, when we asked them, well, why are you doing these interviewees? It's because they wanted the outside world to know about what was happening in the country. So there was a sense of hope there that what they were going to do was going to have an impact, at least, in very least, raising awareness around the world. But I was struck by the lack of hope, particularly the man we interviewed by the border, just such a sense of hopelessness, that things have been this way for generations and they are going to be this way for generations to come. And he said, I think one of his quotes was, generations and generations of my children are going to be living forever in this hopeless hell. People just didn't seem to believe, or don't seem to believe, that the situation is going to improve, because yes, we are noticing the borders creak open. We know that food is starting to come into the country and be better distributed. But as you say, it's this loss of freedom and this increased repression, the way that it's controlling people. It's hard to see how that improves or is undone. And I was also struck by how hard the government have made it for people to escape. It's not just the pandemic and people being told that they can't leave their villages, or there can be no internal movement, which is, of course, stopping people from getting to the border. But the state has fortified this border. It has built fences and surveillance cameras and walls. And that was something that I know there's been a lot of open source work done by journalists to map this border and to see the satellite pictures. But it was something that our two interviews along the border talked a lot about, that there are fences, there are security cameras, there are more guards now. It's impossible to cross. And it's hard to see how that is going to be relaxed.
I feel like, although a lot of what we've talked about here, and particularly on that last question, perhaps makes it seem that the issue is hopeless, but I do think that it's important to remember that the North Korean people just simply have not given up, though. And I think that as dire and as difficult as the situation has been, they have been through incredible challenges over the last few decades, and have continued to press forward and to find unbelievably creative ways to overcome these types of challenges. And I think if anything we have learned from North Koreans that we have been able to meet and speak with and work with, is that the North Korean people are some of the most resilient people I have ever met in the world and in my life. And although things are incredibly difficult right now, I do strongly think there is a reason for us to remain hopeful, just simply by virtue of who the North Korean people are, and the fact that there is, believe it or not, still things that can be done on the outside to support this issue and to support the North Korean people. Despite these incredible challenges, there are still North Korean defectors on the outside who have been able to reestablish contact with their families members inside and communicate with them, still able to send back money to them. Although I had not heard of any stories of people escaping North Korea, particularly during the first year and a half of the pandemic. I have heard of cases of individuals who have managed to get out and cross the border into China, as of the last year. And so, although we are not going to see the types of and the types of change and the rate at which we were seeing change in the North Korean people really pushing back and really pushing for these types of changes inside of the country over the last few decades, I do think that it is a reminder that we also should remain hopeful, and that we also have an opportunity to be more creative and innovative in our approach to this issue as well. The North Korean government is certainly not giving up. And so all the more, I think that is an opportunity for us to rise to that challenge and to continue to push forward with different ways that we can approach this issue. And so, Jean, I think the significance of this piece, this documentary, these interviews, this massive undertaking of a project, it just absolutely cannot be overstated. As we said, the documentary has garnered millions of views since it was published in June. And it demonstrated not only an interest by the public on the situation inside North Korea since the pandemic, but again, just how incredibly valuable these insights are that you were able to garner with just such immense thoughtfulness and caution. And so I am personally incredibly grateful. Thank you for these insights. It is so important for us to understand the situation inside North Korea, so that we can also better understand how we can and should be supporting North Korean people inside and on the outside as well. Before we wrap things up, I don't know if there's any final comments or thoughts that you'd like to share.
I would actually like to give my own, sense of hope, because I know that our reporting was bleak, and a lot of what we've talked about, feels hopeless. But the hope that I got through this process and what I learned was hope for the younger generation. They do think differently and they do act differently. And we have seen this the world over, that the young generation currently seems to be kind of so out of step with generations that have come before. And I get the sense that the North Koreans are no different. They are the ones who are continuing to defy this anti-reactionary thought law. They are continuing to watch the content. They know it's out there. They have a thirst to know. And they are also starting in small ways to challenge the government, I think, in ways that we haven't seen generations in the past do so. I mean, I spoke to one of the defectors, Ru Yong-hoo, who was the former Croatian ambassador who worked in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the North Korean government as part of this piece. And we showed him the full interviews and we were talking a lot about this in depth. And even he was saying to me that he noticed when he defected back in 2019, there had been a real cultural shift amongst the young people even working in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where they had started to question some of the instructions that they were being given and saying, well, why should I do this? Or why should I blindly follow this order? And he was his mind was blown. He said, I've never seen this before. And so I get the sense that young people are starting to challenge. I mean, that we're talking about a small fraction of people, and it's anecdotal, of course, but are starting in some ways to maybe challenge what they are being told. And I think, one of the points that came out was that in previous generations, of North Koreans, the state has at least been providing them with something to sort of ensure their loyalty. But the young generation have grown up receiving absolutely nothing from the state. And they have been put through these 3 years of really, really harsh conditions. And yet they continue to defy the government. So I think there's hope there. I think that was a bit of a rambling point, but yeah, in the younger generation. And there is a reason that Kim Jong Un is trying to control this information so tightly and control the borders. It's because he knows, and he is scared of the impact that this content will have. But young people will keep finding it and they will keep watching it. And there is only, I believe, so much that the government is going to be able to do to stem the flow as we enter an ever more digital age.
Absolutely. And I appreciate that last point from you so much, because it is certainly what we not only believe, but have also seen and heard as well from North Koreans that we're speaking to regularly. And to that point, there has been such significant change that we saw over the last few decades, economic, social, and information changes, that despite sort of the conditions and circumstances of these last few years, as my colleague Sakil likes to say, these things cannot be undone, right? So much of that progress that's been done, some of these changes in beliefs and behaviors that we've seen, particularly from a younger generation, this Changmadang market generation, those things cannot be undone. We cannot rewind and change those things back. And the regime can simply try to slow down some of these changes, and that is exactly what they're trying to do. But as we've said before, there are still opportunities. And I really believe that is what is most important for us to kind of focus on, is to have hope and to continue to look at what we can do in terms of supporting North Korean people in and out of the country to ensure that these types of changes can continue and that we can provide people inside of the country with access to more information and technology to safely consume it and things like that from the outside world. Despite a lot of those fears, there are still individuals that are willing and wanting to consume it. They are still listening to radio, and there are still ways in which we can communicate messages of hope to people inside, that there is this massive global movement of support on the outside that is actually standing with them. And I think that that is one of the biggest things that the North Korean people can have hope for, is to know that they are not alone and that they have not been forgotten. So I want to just wrap things up here very quickly. For everybody that has joined us here today, if you are wondering what you can do to make a difference, there are a few quick things, simple things that if you would like to take an action. First, if you did not yet have a chance to watch this incredible documentary, you can do so on YouTube. We will drop that link into the chat for you right now. And we would also encourage you to check out our friends at the Daily NK. They are an incredible organization doing important work, reporting from inside of the country, and we're such a significant partner on this project as well. We will drop that link for you in the chat too. Second is to please visit withthenorthkoreanpeople.org. There is an opportunity for you to sign the pledge to join this movement and stand in solidarity with the North Korean people. This is something that we hope to be able to continue to communicate to our community of North Korean friends outside and also inside the country, that there are people around this world who are standing with them in their pursuit of freedom. Lastly, we are very excited to be the impact partner on an incredible new documentary that will be coming out in October. This is a documentary that follows the real escape journey of a North Korean family through this sort of modern day underground railroad. The film is called Beyond Utopia. It premiered at the Sundance Film Festival earlier this year, and it won the People's Choice Award for Best Documentary. It will actually be in over 600 theaters in the United States for just 2 days on October 23rd and 24th. You do not want to sleep on this opportunity to see this amazing film and to introduce your friends and family to this issue. So you can check out the trailer and buy your tickets at beyondutopiadoc.com, and we'll drop that link in there for you as well. So be sure to snag your tickets before they are sold out. And for our friends internationally who are tuning in, there will be opportunities to watch the film as well, and we'll keep you all posted when that becomes possible. Jean, thank you so much for joining us today, just for your incredible insights and experiences. It's unbelievable that you have only just moved out to Seoul and begun reporting on this issue 18 months ago, because just your analysis and perspectives and insights on this issue are so deeply appreciated, so nuanced, and we can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us here and to share some of this insight with us today. And so thank you, and thank you to everybody who joined us today as well. And we hope to see you next time.
Thank you, Hannah.